In the early 1940s, as the United States was becoming more and more deeply involved in the war against Hitler and Nazism, I was comfortably situated in Beloit, Wisconsin, as a professor of political science at Beloit College, a well-known small liberal arts college. And I was also a part-time journalist as editorial writer and foreign affairs columnist for the Beloit Daily News. It was a very comfortable life, and I was not involved directly in the war. In fact, as a Quaker and as a pacifist, I had registered as a conscientious objector, and my draft board had approved that status for me. But as I got more and more deeply engrossed in the story of what was happening with Hitler's conquest of Europe, and with particularly his effort to obliterate the Jews, I became more and more outraged at what was going on, and more doubtful that I could hold the position of being a non-combat pacifist. In fact, in spite of the fact that I had no likelihood of being drafted, I felt that I had to be involved in the war. And so I told my draft board that I'd like to rescind my commitment as a conscientious objector and make myself eligible for military service. But in so doing, I realized that as a person of professional background, I could probably get a commission in the military services. So I applied for a commission in the Navy, and I also applied for accreditation as a war correspondent. One day in the same mail, I received two letters, one from the Navy giving me a commission as an ensign in the Navy, the other accreditation as a war correspondent. I did not have to debate long about what I would do, and I decided to go as a war correspondent. And I had the backing of a group of Wisconsin newspapers, the Milwaukee Journal, the Wisconsin State Journal in Madison, the Beloit Daily News, and some others, a group of Wisconsin newspapers which had clubbed together to sponsor me as their correspondent in the war zone. And so in 1944, I set off on the Mediterranean sector. I went in a convoy to Naples and then made my way up to Rome. And from there on, I was fully engaged for the next, until the war was over, as a war correspondent. Among other things, along with many other journalists, I applied for permission to go to Yugoslavia to cover what was happening there after the Russians had helped Tito liberate Belgrade from Nazi control. Something like 200 journalists from all over the world had applied to get into Yugoslavia, and Tito was being very standoffish and was refusing to allow Western journalists to come and covering what was being done in his country. And of course there was great suspicion that Tito, as a good loyal communist who had lived and been trained in the Soviet Union, was doing things that would not be totally pleasing to the Western powers. In any case, there was a great anxiety to get involved in covering Tito. And so you had correspondents stationed in London and Paris and Tokyo and Moscow and Cairo who wanted to go into Yugoslavia. And my name was on the list. One day I go into the press camp in Rome, and there was a little bulletin on the board that said, the following 10 correspondents have been cleared for admission to Yugoslavia. My name was on the list of 10. How I got there, I don't know. I never found out why I was one of those. There was a British correspondent on the list also who happened, as I was, to be in Rome. So the two of us, the only ones of the 12 immediately available, we hitched a ride on a cargo plane from Italy into Belgrade. And there I began my period of covering the war from the point of view of what was happening in the former Yugoslavia, which was in a state of chaos, and Tito was clearly establishing his control. From that experience covering Tito, I came back to Rome at the very end of the war and was in on the final surrender of the field commercial from the Germans on the banks of the Po River. And immediately after that, I got back to Rome, and I had a cable from my office telling me to go immediately to Algiers to cover a story which the French were suppressing. I didn't know what the story was. I didn't know what I would find, but anyway, I hitched a ride on a cargo plane out of Naples to Algiers and got there and started inquiring what was going on. Well, the French wouldn't tell me anything. I went to the American liaison office, and the American major who was in charge there wouldn't tell me anything. But I finally found a businessman, an American, in a hotel lobby, and we got to talking. And I said, "Do you know anything about trouble, the French doing something that's causing some international problem?" He said, "Oh, the riots have been taking place in the riots have been taking place in eastern Constantine province. And as a matter of fact, I'm driving over there away tomorrow. I'll give you a ride if you'd like." So I said, fine, and I hitched a ride then across country about 200 kilometers to a little dusty county seat town of Sétif up on the central plateau back from the sea. And there I discovered the story. On Victory Day, Algerian Boy Scouts and others wanted to take part in a French victory parade in the little town of Sétif. And the French said okay, but warned against any political demonstrations. But in the middle of the parade, the Boy Scouts broke out a sign that said, "Free Masali Haj." Masali Haj was the Arafat of the Algerian rebel movement that was getting underway. And the French were outraged at what they saw, and they beat up the kids, drove them out of the parade, and then all hell broke loose. Fires began to be shot. A number of people were killed. And in that night, word went out on what we call the underground grapevine about what the French had done in killing people in breaking up this demonstration. And so Algerian farm workers stole into the bedrooms of their patrons, killed them in their beds, mutilated their bodies. And the next day, the French really went berserk. They sent in tanks, they sent in troops, they sent in airplanes. As I drove up from the coastal road to Sétif, I had seen some of the village still burning from this assault. By happenstance, I came across a British officer in the bar of a hotel in Sétif. It turned out that he was a British commander and was the chief of British intelligence for North Africa. He'd come to get the story of what the French had done, and he was outraged. So he said to me, "You need a lift back to Algiers?" I said, "Yes, I certainly would." Well, he said, "I'll take you back to my office. I'll open up the British files, and you can see the story as we have it. As far as we can tell, something like 2,000 people were murdered by the French in putting down this demonstration." So I went back with him to Algiers. He opened up his files, and I read British intelligence reports on this. Then I went back to the American liaison office, and by this time I knew so much that the Americans opened up the American intelligence files, and the American officer said, "And I will show you aerial photographs we have taken. You know what these terrible people have done? They've taken our B-25 bombers and bombed the hell out of villages of the Algerians there." So it was one of the great uncovered stories at the end of the war, and I was the only correspondent who ever covered it. So I got an exposure to combat, to wars in various forms, in World War II, in the Mediterranean theater, in Italy, in Yugoslavia, and finally in Algeria. And after that, I was more and more concerned about the whole issue of war and peace and what governments do to cover up what they do in the name of self-defense, what they do in the name of winning wars. And so ever since that particular period of my life, the great central passion of my existence has been to learn more and more about what causes conflicts, how they are carried on, what can be done about them, and how you can break out of a cycle of war and war and more war. I am not a pacifist, but I'm more opposed to militaristic policies than I ever was in my life on the basis of what I've seen. And of course, more recently, the wars that I have observed have been the wars in the Middle East. And here again, I found out that my sense of outrage at what is done in the name of self-defense by any people, whether they're Palestinians, other Arabs, Israelis, or Americans. Excuses are invented over and over again to justify the most bestial behavior as nations undertake to act in what they always will call self-defense. Governments have a way of always excusing whatever they do in the use of force by saying all we were doing is protecting ourselves, defending our national sovereignty, and every nation has the right of self-defense. And this is a kind of issue, a kind of dilemma that I think the world faces, and it's an issue that I devote my life to studying, trying to understand, trying to find a way to deal with it, trying to find a way to help educate people on the possibility that there are other ways of dealing with international disputes than by going to war.